So that was chapter 5, and we're about to go into chapter 6. I know it has been a day late for the drop. Apologize to my 20 subscribers. Totally appreciated. Whether I have 20, 200, or 2,000, every person that gets the opportunity to hear the story makes me elated. And and I'm talking about elation, introduction of Alexos, and the opportunity for Medi to meet someone that gets to see Medi without seeing her physically. And I think that's really important and gives Medi an opportunity to get close and understand someone without this constant fear that her presence or her physical presence is going to affect the relationship. It just, again, I know this seems to be a repeating thing, but beauty can be just as much as a albatross around your neck as people feel ugliness is. I personally believe that you should always look beyond that and always look into this person inside. And you can do that by talking to them, getting to know them, and getting to know their true beauty. And that's the opportunity that Many and Alexis get. So let's go on to chapter 6, A Blissful Moment. My screen locked up. In the years since the incident with Alcibiades, many had withdrawn into the temple and its duties, finding little need for anything beyond her priestly life. The temple was safe and her duties predictable, allowing her an ease she rarely felt beyond the walls. Yet now she could not wait to go beyond its gate and down the winding path to the calm cove. Day after day, she went, each time catching fish and savoring every conversation with Alexos. One day she bounded down to the seashore, but Alexos was not there. She looked around for him. It was rare for her to arrive first. Fear and worry began to rise in her mind. Medi, called out Alexos. She followed the sound and found him further down the shore, and he was with someone, and they were pushing a small boat into the water. As she approached, she saw the other person, Perseus. The two spoke in silent words. Medi was still hurt, and Perseus was still asking for forgiveness. "Hello," Medi said meekly. "Medi, this is Perseus. He is letting us borrow his boat." "I see. What do we need a boat for?" "I wanted to take you to the oyster bed I spoke about. They have been breeding all summer and are surely ripe for the picking." She grinned. "That would be lovely." "I suggest you get started before you lose the low tide," said Perseus. "Just us?" Medi asked in surprise. "Don't worry," Perseus replied. "Lexi is a fine swimmer, and you, as a priestess of Athena, I know you can take care of yourself." Medi could not hide her shock. Was this an apology? Here he was, leaving her alone with a man, and his face was free of judgment. "Care to help me push?" Lexi asked. "Yes," Medi replied, and helped draw the boat into the water. Once they were waist deep, Alexos hopped into the boat and helped her in. "Careful," he said, grasping at her to get a good grip without losing his balance, and tipping them both back into the water. Medi quickly sat down and adjusted her chitin. It was wet and clinging to her body, but she did not have to worry about Alexos staring. Her body relaxed, and she looked around. In the boat was a netted bag, axes, and a chisel, like those used in masonry. Alexos put the oars into place and set to row. "Can I help?" Medi anxiously asked. "Be my eyes," Alexos said in a pleasant tone. She looked back to the shore one more time. Perseus waved, smiled, then turned to leave. She looked back to Alexos. "Where are we going?" "To that southern jut of rocks, the ones that curve. We want to go to be on the inside of it. She nodded, and together they rowed toward the jutting rocks. It did not take long, and she dropped down the anchor as instructed. The water was low and easy to stand in, but it was also very rocky and dangerous to walk on. And as though he knew what she was thinking, he said, "We are going to skim the water. If you must stand, do it on the sand and be careful." He handed her a small leather sack. Put this over your hand." She did. He picked up a chisel and an axe. "We're going to break off oysters. Put the chisel up against the rock, then hammer. Hammer it back. Hammer it with the back of the axe, like this." He tapped the head of the chisel with the back of the axe, making a tinking sound. "Once the oyster is free, you can put it in the bag." "So we are going to just dive in and collect oysters while holding our breath?" He beamed. "Yeah." She returned his smile. He leaned over, pulled out some rope, and tied it to his waist. He then reached over to her and tied another line around hers. She saw the coiled piles of rope were tied to the boat. She marveled at his ingenuity. This was a wise precaution for a simple fisherman, but essential for a blind one. Then, with no more warning, he flipped into the water. She quickly followed. Her instinct was to stand in the shallow water, but there was no footing. She swam up to Alexos, who was treading water near the submerged rock. "Just dive. Grab anything sticking off the rock and chip it off. Ready?" He asked he asked and put his hand out. She slipped her hand into his. "Ready." They both took a deep breath and plunged under. She quickly found she was searching by touch more than sight, unable to keep her eyes open for long in the salty water. She watched Alexos find an outcropping and remove it just as he described. She copied his movements, but barely got one free before she had to come up for air. Alexos' head bobbed out of the water. "You okay?" "Yes, I got one, I think." Is everything okay?" She nodded and said, "Yes, but I can't hold my breath as long as you." "Oh," he replied. "Here." He opened his palm and presented her with a pearl. She looked at him quizzically. He seemed to sense her confusion and laughed softly. "Take it and put it in your mouth. Once underwater, draw in a breath through your mouth, and you can breathe underwater." "Really?" He nodded and smiled. She carefully took the pearl and hesitantly put it in her mouth. "Go on," he encouraged. She slipped back under the water. Her instincts fought her as she willfully drew water into her mouth and down her throat. The sensation of the pearl lodging in her windpipe was alarming, but Alexos' hand fell on her arm in a soothing manner. She willed her lungs to breathe, and as they worked with no concern that she was inhaling water. Medi looked at Alexos, who was holding his own breath and patiently waiting for her to adjust. She touched his hand and squeezed it in assurance. He understood the cue and grasped her hand, drawing her back to the oyster bed. They began to work at the bed. Alexos still held his breath for a long time, but went up for air in intervals. Medi was enjoying this new freedom and wandered from the oyster bed, exploring the ocean floor. So many times she wished she could breathe underwater, and now she could. Even her eyes seemed to sting less, as if her whole body was happy to be immersed. She let her fingers trail in the sand and explored the water. She saw crabs scamper and fish darting in schools. She wandered back to Alexos and watched him work, his muscles moving, each action practiced and sure. His hair swayed like seaweed, and this made her giggle. She swam up to him and brushed his shoulder lightly. He carefully turned, causing little space between them. She braced her hands lightly on his shoulders and kicked her feet softly. He took her cue, and placing his hands on her waist, they both ascended. They broke the surface and Alexo gasped for air. Medi immediately convulsed and the pearl broke free and settled in her mouth. I could feel you swimming around, exploring. She nodded, then replied softly, yes. Then why did you stop? She shifted the pearl to the side of her cheek. I feel very selfish using the pearl. Do you not have another? He shook his head. Only one. It was a gift. From who? Medi watched his face alter slightly as he paused before answering. My patron. Patron? Yes, I have to pay him tribute, and the pearl allows me to do that. She could tell that he was wary to speak about it, which was unusual since he always seemed so open. Like gathering the oysters. Yes, he nodded firmly. Then, she said, lifting one hand from his arm and spitting out the pearl, you use the pearl and I will go explore the shoals. He became aware that he was still holding her waist and gently let go of her. Taking the pearl and slowly putting it in his mouth. She caught herself studying his face and stepped back slightly. Oysters, she said in a directing tone. Exploring, he said in return with a soft grin. She watched him for a moment, amazed at his confident actions. She could barely hit the axe with the chisel with her eyes open, but he did not. He did it with ease. Medi noticed scallops in a sandy patch and found them easier to fetch. She kept an eye on Alexos, but moved further out, sifting through the sand. Her chitin kept getting tangled up in her arms and legs, so she decided to remove it. It was not as if Alexos would notice. She took off the snake girdle and peeled the wet, sticky chitin. Peeled the wet, sticky chitin off, tossing it into the boat. As she was reaching into a patch of seaweed to grab the pink shell poking out of the sand, an eel slithered out and locked eyes with her. Fear rose inside Medi, but she did not move. The eel watched her, then it slowly slithered around her arm, then across her torso and down her leg. The sensation was alarming, but she did not move, fearing it would attack. It did not, but continued to linger as if it was watching her. Her lungs began to burn for air. She carefully placed her foot on the ground and lifted her leg above the water, watching the eel the whole time. He stared back. She stood, breathing in the fresh air, but not letting her eyes off the eel. It moved towards her again, slithering around her body, but did not bite. The sensation of its skin sliding across hers was both frightening and exhilarating. It undulated and slowly moved, gripping her bare torso and cupping her breasts, then slid down and around her thigh. She quickly glanced to find Alexos, but he was still collecting the oysters. Her breath quickened, not from fear, but from strange ignition of desire. Her head felt foggy, as if she were intoxicated. Luckily, Alexos' rope was near enough for her to reach out and tug. Her fingers fumbled for the rope, but finally got a strong grip and pulled. Alexos immediately responded and came up to the surface. Unsure of her location, he called out, Medi, are you okay? Yes, she said tentatively, but I seem to have made a friend. She gently pushed the eel from her nether. It did not like that and gripped tightly. What? An eel, she said, a little breathless. I have an eel swimming around me, and he won't leave. Can you catch him in your chitin? Perplexed with how to answer him, Medi tried to come up with any answer but the truth. Medi, he asked in the long pause. She stammered. I'm not wearing it. He was slow to respond, but finally asked, "Where is it?" "In the boat." "Okay," he replied and moved towards her. As he got close, the eel coiled around Meddy's waist and squeezed. She lightly gasped, "He's around my waist." Meddy felt strangely compelled to reach out and stroke the eel. Its head slipped between her breasts and stared up at her. He was smooth, slick, and warm. Her nerves were all firing, and her strange compulsion to slip under the water forever intensified. Alexos stopped moving. "Poseidon," Alexos began, "please, spare the fair maiden. She is too beautiful to meet a watery grave." The prayer appeared to work as the eel let go and swam away. Her eyes followed him, still feeling a great pull to follow. Images of living forever under the water were unusually compelling. As he swam out of sight, her head began to clear and she looked up at Alexos. "He's gone." "I think that is enough for today," he said. "Can you get the bag? I let it go when you tugged on the rope." She nodded and swam to get it. When she came back with the bag, he was already in the boat. He took it and then offered his hand. With his help, she scrambled back into the boat. "I'm sorry," Meddy began, feeling ashamed. He touched her kindly. "Don't be." Pulling his hand away, he asked, care to tally our haul?" She nodded and replied, "Yes." She handed over the leather cloth he used to hold the oysters. He grabbed what looked like a barnacle rock and tapped it with the back of his axe. Each knock broke away the rock into smaller pieces until the oyster appeared. Meddy assisted, handing over a rock and putting the unveiled oysters back into the net bag. Alexos pulled out a scallop and ran his thumb across the smooth pink shell. "I didn't catch these." "I did," she replied. "That's wonderful. It is not easy for me to find scallops. Thank you." She blushed, though he could not see it. "You're welcome." "Help me clear the debris?" "Of course." And they both tossed the barnacles and rocks back into the sea. "Meddy," Alexos began, "can I ask you something?" "Yes," she replied and looked at him. He seemed apprehensive. "May I kiss you?" Her heart fluttered. "You're asking?" "Well, if I simply tried, I could easily miss." He smirked slightly. She merrily grinned and laughed lightly. She looked down at his hands, which he was softly rubbing in an anxious fashion. She reached out and took one, placing it on her face. "There, now you can't miss." He was elated by her action. His thumb ran across her lips before he leaned forward and kissed her. She responded, pulling closer, taking in his lips, tasting the salt water mixed with the sweetness of his mouth. She inhaled sharply, finding his touch euphoric. They pulled closer, and he wrapped his arms around her waist. She slipped into his lap, both desiring more, she slipped into his lap, both desiring more. But he quickly broke the kiss and pushed back in a breathless gasp. She grasped it at the sides of the boat as it rocked erratically. "What?" Meddy asked in a panicked tone. She was feeling the same headiness of the eel had caused, but when he pushed her away, fear replaced lust. The judging eyes of the elders flashed across her mind. She was doing exactly what they accused her of, nothing but a lustful temptress. "I'm so sorry. I should have said no. What must you think?" "Meddy, you didn't do anything wrong." He reached for her, but he was careful not to touch her. "It's just," he cleared his throat, "you were naked." "Oh," she declared, and quickly found her chitin. It was wet and clung to itself, making it difficult to unfurl and put on. Waves of shame crashed down on her, forcing tears to well and fall. She sniffled and fruitlessly fought the chitin. The boat rocked, and as she struggled to get it on, part of it smacked Alexos in the face. He grunted in shock. She gasped, then half laughed, half cried, finally getting the sticky cloth back on. I'm so sorry. He was beaming. Doesn't matter. Except he could hear her sniffling. What? Why? Why should I have said no? Or why should you have said no? Medi, why are you upset? Because I have a reputation. He moved closer in a motion of empathy and not desire. Medi, I cannot lie. I know the stories, but she looked away, trying to wipe away her falling tears. But I have also spoken with your friends, Perseus, Uriel, Stenho. She glanced back at him. You have? Why? Because I wanted to know more than the stories. I wanted to know you, and I learned that besides being an excellent fisher, you are an admired priestess and beloved by those that know you. Why not ask me? I have, but you tend not to talk about yourself. Oh, well, she lightly shrugged. I also know that someone hurt you, and that means it is hard to trust. He worked his best to face her and show his seriousness. I will never do anything without your consent. She smiled back, but knowing he could not see, she took his hand, lifting it to her face. His eyes glistened as he stroked her cheek. Thank you, he said. Thank you for the kiss. Medi was moved by his gentle compassion and his clear respect. She buried her face in his hand and pulled him closer. He followed her lead and curled his arms around her. Never had Medi felt safe in a man's arms, and she feared nothing in his embrace. She lifted her head and kissed him once more. So that was chapter 6, and on to chapter 7 next week, or the next playlist if you are catching up. And go ahead and subscribe, share, and hopefully you are enjoying this. If you have any comments, please put them in below or let me know, and I would be happy to answer them.